Then Miss Sabrina put this thing around me that was supposed to be a horse. There was a horse head in front and a horse rump and tail in back. And there was a place for me in the middle. The whole thing hung from my shoulders by 2 straps. To make the horse go, I had to run like this. Bada-boom, bada-boom, bada-boom. As she hooked me into the horse, she said, "Now here's all you have to do. Wait behind the curtains, and whenever I say, 'Someone will save me,' you come galloping all the way across the stage, right past me. And you wave your sword and yell, 'I'll save you, princess.' Then you go behind the curtains on the far side and wait there. And when I say that line again, you run out and do the same thing, okay?" I nodded and said, "Okay," because I was already strapped into the costume, and the lady was ready to start. What else could I do? I hid behind the curtain, and Mrs. Sabrina starts telling her story. The way the story went, she said, "Someone will save me," about 20 times. Then this dopey knight would gallop across the stage yelling, "I'll save you, princess." That was a big joke. That was me. I was the big dopey joke. Finally, the story was over. Mrs. Sabrina made me and my horse come to the center of the stage. I had to hold her hand and take a bow. Then I galloped over behind the curtain, and I got out of that costume in about 3 seconds. I think I set a new record for blushing that day, even though there was a show up on the stage. Every time I look around, it feels like half the kids in the auditorium were looking at me. So I tried not to notice. And it worked, because after a while I forgot about my terrible time on the stage, and I just watched the rest of the story like everyone else. At the end of the last story, everybody clapped like crazy. It really was a great assembly. All the teachers stood up, and Mrs. Carr walked onto the stage. She held up her hand, and the clapping stopped. Mrs. Carr said, "I know I speak for everyone when I tell Mrs. Sabrina how much we all enjoyed her performance today. Let's all give her one last round of applause." So we all started clapping and cheering again. Then Mrs. Carr held up her hand again, and the noise stopped, just like turning off a TV. Mrs. Carr said, "And before I forgot, Jake, would you come back up on stage?" The whole auditorium got quiet except for some scattered giggling. I turned bright red and walked up onto the stage. Mrs. Carr motioned for me and to come and stand beside her. Then she said, "I think we should also give a nice round of applause to our young man of many talents, our own Jake Drake." Then, as she said my name, she reached down and patted me on the head. I'm not sure who started it, but I think it was Ben Grumpson. Because when the kids started clapping, someone began saying, "Jake Drake, Jake Drake, Jake Drake." And every kid in the room picked up on it. 400 kids started chanting my name. Then the strangest thing I ever seen happened. Instead of frowning and stopping and chanting like she could have, Mrs. Carr smiled and started clapping her hands, and she chanting along with the kids. "Jake Drake, Jake Drake, Jake Drake." I couldn't believe it. I feel like I was in a movie where aliens had taken over a school and made everyone acted completely nuts. After all, the kids and teachers and Mrs. Carp had changing my name about 15 times. It was starting to feel like the roof might blow off the auditorium. Finally, Mrs. Carp held up her hand, and right away the noise stopped. Because even in the middle of the roads, no one would never mess around with Mrs. Carp. And then the principal dismissed us to go back to our classroom and got ready for lunch, like nothing strange had happened at all. So I tried to act that way too. I kept my eyes on the floor and went back toward our classroom. And when some kids on the hallway started chanting, Jake, Drake, Jake, Drake, Jake, Drake, I didn't look up. I just kept walking. I was so glad to be back in my own classroom. It was going to be so good to go to lunch and sit down in a quiet corner with Willie. I opened my desk to get my lunch, and I gasped. A bunch of kids turned to look at me. I must have sounded like I had seen a ghost, except it was scarier, and that for me because I had forgotten. There under my lunch bag was the most horrible thing I ever seen. That bright orange patrol belt. I was not going to have a quiet lunch with my best friends. For the second time in 1 hour, I was going to put on a costume and get on a stage. This time I wasn't going to be a knight in shining armor. This time I had to put on a floppy orange belt and walk into the cafeteria because every kid in grades 3, 4, and 5 is waiting for me. Everyone is waiting for a garbage guy. Chapter 4. Dangerous. I thought about just not wearing the orange patrol belts, to lunch. I thought about it for 3 seconds or so. Then I remembered Mrs. Carp. She would be in the cafeteria too. She had said I would wear the thing for the rest of the week. I guess she thought wearing the belt is supposed to be in honor, and maybe like having a black belt in karate, except it wasn't. So I pulled the thing out of my desk. I looked over my shoulder. I looked it over one shoulder, hooked it around my waist, grabbed my lunch, and went out into the hall. Right away, a group of 4th grade girls started pointing at me and giggled. But I just held my head up high and walked toward the cafeteria. I kept walking. I said to myself, I can live through this. I know I can. I can do this. And I just pretended that nothing was the matter. Then I got to the cafeteria. I looked for Willie, but he wasn't at our regular table. Then I saw him in the milk line. When I went over to say hi, Willie started talking to me like a spy. He kept looking straight ahead, and he tried not to move his lips. He whispered, I can't eat lunch with you today. I whispered back, how come? He said, Mrs. Carp, she'll know it was me. What do you mean? I asked. Willie said, Me. I left that big mess yesterday. I said, But I'll tell her we played rock, paper, scissors and I lost. Willie shook his head. Better not. See you at recess. And maybe Willie was right, because Mrs. Carp was already prowling around the lunchroom. She was on the lookout for treasures. So I got some milk and went to find a place to sit. And as I looked around the cafeteria, it felt like there was a big sign at every table, and the sign said, No teacher's pet allowed.